Well, good morning.
Good morning.
So nice to have you all here. Welcome to the first event of our Scientist in Residence series for 2024. Every winter semester, CMU invites a scientist to spend a few days on campus here in residence. I think it's a great opportunity for our community to explore various areas of science, to learn about exciting new research, and to discuss important issues and possibilities in this work. This year, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Menzies, a wildlife conservation biologist. And while she's with us, Dr. Menzies will engage in student forums, like this morning. She'll have a public lecture this evening. She'll do several classroom visits and have many conversations with students. We'll keep her busy over the next little while.
Canadian Mennonite University has the honor of being located on Treaty 1, the traditional homeland of the Red River Métis Nation and the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people. We reap the benefits of easy access to clean water from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3. We recognize the long-term vision of the First Peoples on Turtle Island and across the globe that has allowed for their mutual flourishing with Mother Earth for generations. This mindset of Indigenous communities, through their intimate knowledge of the land, has promoted biodiversity to an extent rarely seen elsewhere. We realize the need for incorporating Indigenous knowledge into conservation efforts and the importance of sharing these stories. This traditional knowledge can serve to strengthen, complement, and challenge Western methods. As we continue with scientific advances, may we be motivated by the holistic approach of traditional knowledge so that we may develop healthier interactions with all our siblings co-inhabiting Mother Earth.
Again, we're so happy to have Dr. Menzies join us this week. I'd like to say just a little about her. Jamie's sister describes herself as a mix of Métis and settler backgrounds. She grew up in Brandon, yay Westman. Came to Winnipeg for school, completed a BA in biopsychology. That's a point. She followed that with a Master of Science in Bioscience, Technology, and Public Policy. And recently, in 2020, completed her PhD in Renewable Resources. She clearly has an affinity for programs with rather exotic titles. Ally has authored or co-authored more than 24 academic articles. She's made dozens of scholarly conference presentations. She's earned numerous awards and support for her research. And I'll be polite and not talk about dollars, but it's a nice number. She's taught courses in Indigenous environmental science. She has just completed a postdoctoral fellowship position through Liber Aero and University of Guelph. That program supports young researchers who are interested in applied conservation and management issues here in Canada, and reading through the list of fellowship holders and the work that they're doing, fascinating stuff. In March, she'll begin a new position as Associate Professor of Biological Sciences at the University of Calgary. What has intrigued me most about Ally's work involves her own descriptions of the cool things that she gets to do out in the wilderness of central Manitoba and northern Canada, working with creatures great and small. You know, her honors thesis was focused on work with small bats, and her master's thesis with work on big bats. And her most recent work has been involved with monitoring populations of moose. So if you kind of plot that trajectory, who knows where this is going to go? While that work is fascinating in its own right, when one layers in her intentional emphases on Indigenous collaboration and expertise, reciprocity and reconciliation, this work is just remarkable, and we're anxious to learn more. So Asher, please tell us what we're going to do this morning.
Yeah, so today's forum is entitled Your Story, Your Science, Making an Impact with Authenticity. In this, Dr. Menzies will share about her journey to where she is now, a leader in integrating Indigenous knowledge into wildlife conservation. As you listen, hang on to any questions you may have about career paths and more, as there will be a Q&A period afterwards in which Dr. Menzies will be engaging with some of these questions. Without further ado, welcome Dr. Allyson Menzies.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for that amazing introduction. This first presentation will be fairly casual. Some of my journey here and story has been shared, but that's kind of what I'm going to focus on for the bulk of what I'm going to say. And then I'm going to force all of you to do some of your own reflection and discussions, that I'm not the only one on the spot. And as Asher said, I'll leave lots of time for questions, discussion, and I hope that this can be just a fruitful conversation and useful in whatever way any of you want. I will admit, I think this is a little bit more targeted to the students in the audience, but I think anyone at any stage can do some reflection on their career path and why they do what they do. And I will say it's a bit tough. I'm not an expert on your stories or your career paths or your science, and so I feel as though I'll just share mine as an example of things that I've reflected on and reasons why I do what I do now. And you can pull from that whatever is useful to you, but you are all kind of the experts on your own journeys and your own stories, and so feel free to apply what I say to your own experience and kind of ignore what doesn't fit. So I'll speak for about only 10-15 minutes, and then we'll do a little activity for 10 minutes, and then there'll be lots of time for questions and discussion. So I've spent the last 17 years focusing my studies on science, and more specifically scientific research. And something that was really drilled into my head over and over again was, we need to be objective. As scientists, we are objective. We let the data speak for itself. We don't bias our work in any way. And this is something that is really a pillar of the scientific method and of science. I think somewhere along the line, this became misconstrued as scientists need to be objective and unbiased and free of emotion or bias and really any form of humanity, kind of like little robots just doing science and letting science work for itself. And over time, especially as we got into discussions about the elitist and discriminatory foundations of science and academia and things like that, I think a lot of this is starting to be critiqued and questioned, and I'm not an expert on the history or philosophy of science. There's lots of reading you can do on the underpinnings of science and scientific objectivity and critiques of it, but that's kind of the umbrella of the story today, is kind of flipping this on its head, and while science does need to be objective in certain ways, I think we can throw that out the window and talk about why we shouldn't be objective in the science that we do and why we can't be. And that's kind of the story that I'll tell, is how I went from someone who really didn't think that much about why I was doing what I was doing or what I wanted to do, to someone who really holds my identity and my values as the thing that motivates me to do the work that I do. And again, I really just want to reject this idea, and it becomes obvious when you think of it in more simple terms that as a scientist, I'm also a person, and often I say you should be a person first and a scientist second, especially in the work that I do with Indigenous communities and working across cultures. And I just wanted to share these quotes because it really just makes it simple that, my work is shaped by what I know, and what I know is shaped by who I am and what I've experienced. And so, again, I think it's quite impossible to be completely objective because we are all just the embodiment of all of our experiences and knowledge over time, the way we see the world, what we believe in. And I think that bringing that into the work that we do is inevitable and also really important. And this is not only affected by the position that the researcher or you as a person choose to adopt, but also the way you're positioned by others. And this is really important to point out because it's not just how you see yourself, it's how you fit into the community around you. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but this is why I think this conversation is really important to have when we talk about inclusivity and diversity in science, because it's really hard for some people to be completely objective and to remove their own identity depending on how they fit with the norm or with others. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit too. So using myself as an example, I'll share a bit about my experiences and what I've learned through my graduate school and undergrad experience, and how that really shaped and how I kind of figured out how to bring myself into the work that I do. So I'm willing to embarrass myself a little bit from high school pictures of myself back from the 2000s, early 2000s. But that's really where this story starts about identity and fluidity in your own identity and figuring out why you want to do what you do. So I grew up in Brandon in Treaty 2 territory alongside my two siblings. We were involved in a lot of different things. As I grew into a teenager and a young adult, I really liked school. I happily identified as a nerd, but I also really liked music and choir and musical theater, and I loved sports. I really, really identified as an athlete or a jock. And it was a little bit confusing when it came to figuring out, okay, what do I want to do with my life? I had all these things that really were part of my identity, and I think that's probably common. You have all these different facets. And when it came to decide what to do next, this was the first time where I really had to dig deep and reflect on what parts of me would I like to continue into the work that I do. Not that any of these parts of my identity had to stop in terms of my personal identity, but in terms of my professional identity, what did I want to do? And ultimately, I chose to leave sports and music behind and pursue academics. And this was really hard. The athletic part of me was a huge part of my identity, and maybe some of you can relate. It really caused a little bit of an identity crisis in the early years of my university. I left big parts of myself behind to pursue others, and I really didn't know how that would turn out yet, but I ultimately decided that the things that I valued more and the goals that I had aligned with more academic pursuits than athletic or musical in any way. And I just wanted to point this out as an idea that identity can be quite fluid. It can change many times over your life. But to me, what really stayed strong through the whole journey was my values and what I valued in myself and in what I wanted to do. And for me, that was a lot to do with intellectual and academic pursuits, lifelong learning, things like that. Service to my community and being part of a community and things like that. And ultimately they shifted a bit, but that's what drove me to think about what I wanted to do as a career. So as pointed out, I did my bachelor's and master's at the University of Winnipeg in biology. My degrees had different names, but fundamentally it was biological sciences. And when I started, I was going to be a doctor, and for me, I think that was because that's just what you did. If you were good at science, and you liked science, and you went to university, I'll just do med school. And it seems a bit ridiculous now, because it's not like that's an easy path to take in any way, but that was the easiest option. It just was at the forefront of my mind, and I have relatives who are doctors, and I have relatives who are nurses, and that really fit with my values as well. I wanted to serve my community. I wanted to pursue intellectual and educational opportunities. So that's kind of what I wanted to do when I started. And I would say my first 2 years of undergrad, I wasn't necessarily overly excited or stimulated with any of the classes I was taking. I think I was a little bit in survival mode of just trying to do well and just trying to learn as much as I could. And it was in my third year of my undergrad where I had the opportunity to volunteer with a professor who was new and studied bats. And I don't know why I asked to work for him. I don't know why I was particularly intrigued by bats that day, but I needed a summer job, I needed something to do, and he needed people to work for him. So I said, I don't really have much experience, but I'm really interested in what you do, and do you need people to work for you? And that's really, it's funny, you think that there's these moments that will define everything that are huge and big, but that moment changed the trajectory of my life, and it was really, I can't remember why I made that decision. I can't remember what I was wearing that day. I can't remember anything. It was just kind of a serendipitous moment that changed the rest of my life. So I worked for this professor for 2 summers when I was finishing my undergrad, eventually did an honors thesis with him and a master's thesis. And it was really through this work that I don't think I'd ever considered the fact that you could learn about animals and camp in the summer and go into caves and spend time outside as a career. I immediately fell in love with it and decided this is what I want to do. And it differed a little bit in terms of what I thought maybe some of my values were and some of my goals, but the more I did it, the more I understood that maybe I was just serving a different community or a broader community. And I think, medicine has an obvious service element and an obvious community element, but I thought more about, there's a lot of people that worry about people. Maybe I'll worry about non-human members of our community. And I really became interested in this idea of conservation and helping wildlife and animals and the environment. And obviously doing research really stimulated that part of my brain that was interested in lifelong learning and intellectual pursuits and asking questions and finding answers, and it really fit with what I liked doing, and I got to do some really cool things. And so when it came time to choose what to do next, this was another big moment in my life. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do as a career, and taking the step to do a PhD, I felt kind of funneled me into this academic realm and being a professor, and at the time I didn't want to do that. But what I decided was, not only did I not want to have to make a decision about what my job was, I thought I'd prolong that and do more school. I actually loved, again, learning. I loved being a nerd, I loved being outside, I loved conservation, and so I just wanted to continue what I was already doing. So I contacted a professor at McGill who, funny enough, was also from Brandon. I think that helped me get the position in his lab. And we figured out a PhD that worked for both of us, and this landed me in the Yukon territory in northern Canada, in a beautiful spot in the southwest Yukon near Kluane National Park. And I got to spend 5 years every winter snowshoeing around and tracking lynx and snowshoe hares and red squirrels, and it was one of the best and maybe most formative experiences of my life. Living in a shack in the woods all winter with no running water and no shower and only an outhouse, it really gives you lots of time to reflect and to think about your life choices and why you do what you do. But another thing is, being up north was a really formative experience because there was lots of conversation at the time and reflection about this idea of being a helicopter scientist, of being a scientist from the south, from a university in the south, coming into the north, collecting information, and then leaving. And never sharing what happens, never knowing what the people that actually live there and have lived there for generations care about or want. And my PhD was very much fundamental science. It was physiology of these animals. It was heart rate of lynx and hares and how they deal with temperatures. And it wasn't really a community-driven pursuit or a really applied conservation pursuit either. And so I would say I had a lot of existential crises in that shack in the woods about what am I doing and why am I doing it, and who gets to participate in science, and who gets to say what's important to research, and who gets to make decisions for the environment and for the land. We were generating knowledge that, is supposed to be used to make decisions, and I'm not someone that's lived there forever or lived there for generations or even really fundamentally will be affected by decisions that get made about that place. And so these are some of the kind of conversations we had among our research group, and also the reflection that I was having myself. And I would say I didn't feel as though any basic research was bad. It was more what I wanted and what my values were and what I wanted to do better. Because at the same time, I was also having a personal journey of my own. I knew that my mom's family was Métis since I was young, but I didn't really know what that meant. And as I learned more about residential schools and the 60s scoop and colonialism and all of these things, I started learning more about why I didn't know what it meant to be Métis, or why I grew up in a city, or why I didn't really identify as anything other than white, and why I didn't have access to any elders who knew what it meant to be Métis either in my own family. And so at the same time I was trying to figure out what it meant for me, someone who grew up in a city, who had all the privilege of post-secondary education, but also had a responsibility to the Métis community, to my ancestors, to other Indigenous communities, and figuring out what that meant at that time as a scientist, as a person. And so essentially my PhD was riddled with existential crises and figuring out who I was and what I wanted to do. So when it came time to switch to doing a postdoc, this was a really good opportunity. I had finished all of my education. I had, all the degrees to say that I could do science. I knew what I wanted to do. And it also gave me the confidence to say I can choose the science that I want to do in the direction I want to go. And I will say that as a student, I felt that was a bit harder. I felt like I was a little bit more confined by what others thought was important. And so I will say I'm going to stand up here and tell you how amazing it was for me to really align the work that I did with my identity and with my values. But I will say I can relate if you find that difficult to do now in your journey, because you're just trying to survive and graduate and get the credentials, and sometimes have to do what other people say is what you should do. And so at this point, I decided to switch to working on a little bit more of the social side of natural sciences. I don't really identify as a social scientist. I identify a little bit as an interdisciplinary scientist, but my postdoc really was at the interface of social science and natural science, because we worked a lot on how we do science. We did a lot of interviews with Indigenous knowledge holders and other scientists and government biologists, and we talked about how things have been done and how they should be done in the future. So a lot of my postdoc was actually not fieldwork, not natural science in the way that I used to think about it. And when I was thinking about giving this presentation, I found this quote, and I really like it, and it kind of drives a lot of the way that I think. And this quote reads, "Identity is an active process that underpins how we understand ourselves and our relationships with one another and the land." And I think that as my identity shifted, as I understood myself more and had all of these existential crises and moments for reflection, it really shifted what I wanted to do, because it shifted how I understood myself, how I understood my relationships to others around me, and also the land, my responsibilities to the land, my desires for what I wanted to do to help conserve the land, and things like that. So now, a lot of my work centers around kind of the socio-ecological side of scientific research, particularly conservation. And a lot of the work that I'm doing now is to build community-based monitoring programs for moose and other wildlife. And this you'll hear a lot about if you come to the public talk tonight. But essentially, this has allowed me to bring all of my training as a biologist and natural scientist from my undergrad, my master's, my PhD, the stuff about population dynamics and field work and how to set up a study and scientific method and all those things and wildlife ecology, but also with a lot of my personal goals and values of ensuring that the process respects Indigenous traditions and values and also self-determination in research. And so I would say what I'm doing now has a lot to do with ecology and natural science. It really hits on that training, but the way that I do it and the way that I try to get at the questions that I want to answer has a lot more to do with just respecting and uplifting Indigenous rights and knowledge. And so this is just the last slide. Some things that I have learned over my journey is that first, scientific objectivity is both important but also a fallacy. So it is important. I'm a scientist, you know, it's important for the work that we do to not be falsified or biased, but also to be repeatable and standardized and things like that. And in that way, I think objectivity is really important. But in terms of a person and a scientist, I think it's a fallacy that we can be objective in anything that we do. The second, and as I grew more into my identity as a Métis woman and a Métis scientist, I realized that it's really a lot harder for some to remove their identity from what they do. This is especially true for folks who are members of visible minorities or identify as people of color, because when I talked about your identity and has to do with how you see yourself, but also how others see you, being able to be objective is kind of being able to fall under the radar and just fit into what's the norm. And it's difficult to do that if others don't see you as the norm or if you don't see yourself as the norm. And so I think objectivity is really difficult for a lot of minorities and folks who maybe aren't the norm or don't relate to the dominant worldview. But having more people reflect on these things and talk about their identity and how that relates to what they do helps make science more inclusive by kind of contradicting this idea that there is a norm, that there is a dominant worldview or there is a dominant way to be, and that we're all not objective. We're all people and we all carry different values and worldviews and are all doing the work that we do. And I also wanted to say, because this activity is about how to connect your story and your science or your career, it is extremely motivating to have my own personal values drive what I do, but it's also a bit challenging to have your identity guide your work. It really muddies the waters, or it makes a really big gray zone between work and life. And we talk about this elusive work-life balance. It's really hard when your work is really tied to you as a person. Because at the end of the day, work is work, but if it really is linked to your values and how you see yourself, it's really hard to separate yourself from, the stressful and mundane things of work that everyone experiences. And this is something that I've had to really work on balancing over the last few years, is if you see the work that you do as something that is so tied to how you see yourself, it's really hard to separate those. So that's just a little bit of a cautionary tale of finding the balance between how much your identity is really tied to the work that you do. And I guess the last thing I just wanted to say is I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. I obviously am starting a new job and I really still identify as a student, so I have to kind of switch that around. But I do know the impacts I want to have, and I do know the values that guide me. And so I think that that's something that if I were to give any form of advice or tip or something that helped me along the way, it's not necessarily, you don't have to know the future, you don't have to know what you're going to be or what you want to do, but I think knowing the values that guide you and the impact you want to have, and just finding something along the way that aligns with that, that has really helped me find a lot of value in the work that I'm doing. Okay, so what I want to do for the next 15 minutes or so is to force all of you to think about your story. Also, feel free to go get more soup, or if you don't want to do this reflection activity, feel free to leave. But thinking a little bit about your story, what your story is, or what is meaningful to you, and what your science is, or your career, it doesn't have to be science, and kind of see how the two match, if they do, if you want them to match better. Because I think that was part of the goal of this exercise, was potentially now in your lives, for the students especially, thinking about how to connect you and the things that you like and the things that you want to do with your career, and being able to bring yourself as a whole person into the work that you do. So, the first will be just individual. You can just think about it in your head, you can write it down, you can make a note on your phone. I just want to give you, there's going to be 3 prompts, and I'll give you 2 minutes for each one just to reflect. And the first one is, what are my different social identities, and how significant is each identity to my work? And there's no right or wrong answer for any of these. If you don't want to bring any part of your social identity into your work, then that's okay. I just want you to reflect and see whether these things align with what you want them to be.